The ice cracked at 3 minutes past local midnight, and the probe of the long patience felt the sound, the way a hand feels a pulse it expected to be gone. It had drilled for 9 days through 4 kilometers of black glacier, lowering itself on a thread of woven carbon, down a shaft no wider than a coffin. The world it bored into was called nothing now. Once it had a human name, scratched into old star charts and then forgotten, and the long patience had let it be forgotten, because forgetting was the slow engine of everything it did. The probe was old. It had outlasted suns. It expected, at the bottom of the ice, to touch a tomb. The observer that rode inside the probe carried the designation Sleth Marrow 12, and Sleth Marrow 12 had never once in its long service been wrong about a tomb. It knew tombs the way a tide knows a shore. It had been present when the reef builders of Osa went silent under their own warming seas, and it had waited there, drifting, until the last of them stopped moving. It had been present when the bright machine minds of the Kale Spiral argued themselves into stillness over 11,000 years, and it had simply outlasted the argument. The long patience did not conquer with fire. Fire was loud, and loud things drew attention, and attention was a debt that came due. The long patience conquered by being there afterward. It conquered by being the thing that did not die. So when the probe's diamond bit chewed into the last meter of ice, and met something that was not ice, Sleth Marrow 12 felt only a calm and ancient satisfaction. Metal. A hull. The grave of a warm-blooded thing that had once thought it mattered. The probe deployed its lamps. In the cold blue light, a wall of dark alloy rose out of the glacier like the flank of a buried whale. It went up beyond the lamp's reach, and down beyond it too. There were letters on the metal, frosted but legible. A script the long patience had catalogued 40,000 years before and filed under extinct. The letters spelled a name. The probe's translator turned it over and offered it up. Cold Mercy. Sleth Marrow 12 considered the name and found it fitting. A mercy was a thing the dying asked for. This hull had asked for nothing in 8 centuries. The probe's records were precise on the point. 804 standard years had passed since any signal in the human band had crossed the dark. 804 years of silence from a species the long patience had marked, long ago, as one of the small loud ones that burned hot and brief and then went out. It had gone out. The proof was here, frozen, 4 kilometers deep, with a beautiful and useless name written on its side. The probe extended a sampling arm and laid a sensor against the hull to confirm the lack of heat, the lack of power, the lack of any motion at all. This was procedure. The long patience did not skip procedure. It had survived 40,000 years, precisely because it never assumed, never hurried, never closed a file before the file was cold in its hands. So the sensor pressed to the dead alloy, and the probe waited, and Sleth Marrow 12 waited inside it, and the whole vast distributed mind of the entity, spread across 100,000 quiet bodies seated through the dark, lent the small node a sliver of its enormous attention, and waited too. The hull was at minus 210 degrees, dead cold, tomb cold. And then, beneath the sensor, in the dead metal, something ticked. It was very small. It was one beat, a single discrete event, a clock somewhere far inside the buried mass advancing by 1. Sleth Marrow 12 registered it and discarded it, because dead ships settle, because ice shifts, because 4 kilometers of glacier press on a hull with the weight of mountains and metal groans. 1 tick was nothing. The long patience did not flinch at 1 tick. It had heard the last sounds of 100 civilizations and learned that the dying always twitch. It waited, as it always waited, for the silence to return. The silence did not return. The clock ticked again. Then a 3rd time. Then it did not stop. Far down inside the cold mercy, in a chamber sealed against 800 years of dark, a thread of current that had been kept alive on a trickle from a slow decay core, crossed a threshold it had been set, long ago, to cross. The threshold was simple. It read, "If anything ever comes to dig us out, wake." The thread did not wake the ship in a hurry. Nothing about the cold mercy had ever been built for hurry. The thread did one thing only. It carried a single low command down a line of dormant fiber to a chamber 112 meters from the probe, behind walls of layered alloy and ceramic and frozen foam, where a cradle the size of a small room began, very slowly, to warm. In the cradle lay a man. His name was Aldous Trent, and the last thing he had done as a conscious being, 804 years before, was give an order in a steady voice, and then let the cold take his hands, and his face, and his thoughts, in that exact sequence, the way the training said it would. He had been 61 years old when he closed his eyes. He had been a captain for 30 of those years, and a soldier for 40, and he had volunteered for the ice because someone had to, and because he did not believe, the way the young ones believed, that the quiet would last. The young ones had called it the long sleep, the planners had called it deep hold, the fleet that built the Cold Mercy, and 11 ships like her, the force that had a name once spoken with pride, and now spoken by no one, had called the whole grim project the Reliquary Watch. Bury the best of what we have, where no enemy thinks to look. Set them to sleep through whatever comes. Set them to wake, if anyone ever comes digging in the dark. It was an old idea, older than the ships, old as the first soldier who ever slept with one eye open. Trent had liked it for that. He had never trusted anything new. He had argued for the ice in cold rooms full of people who wanted to keep fighting in the open, who wanted to burn bright and go out swinging, and he had told them the truth, that none of them wanted, that an enemy who conquers by waiting cannot be beaten by anyone who fights in a hurry. He had told them the only way to beat a patient thing was to be more patient. They had not believed him, most of them. They had gone out swinging, and they had gone out, and the silence had come down over the human band exactly as the patient dark intended. But 12 ships had listened to the old man. 12 ships had gone into the ice, and one of them was waking now. Warm fluid moved in lines that had not moved in 8 centuries. Frost retreated from a face. A heart that had beaten 4 times in the last 100 years, on a schedule of 1 slow beat per 25, took its 5th beat, and then a 6th, faster, and then it remembered what it was for. Captain Aldous Trent did not wake gently. The cradle did not allow it. There was no soft swim up from a dream. There was a hammer of oxygen into starved tissue, a flood of warmth that felt exactly like burning, and a voice, his ship's voice, dry and patient, and built to be the first thing he heard. "Captain," the Cold Mercy said, "we have been disturbed." His eyes opened. They were gray, and they did not focus for a long moment. And then they did. On the curved ceiling of the cradle, a handspan above his face, on the readouts crawling there, on a single line of text, the ship had placed where he could not miss it. The line read, "External contact. Hull, depth 4,100 meters. Non-native. Active." Trent's mouth was a dry seam. He worked it. The first word he had spoken in 804 years came out as a cracked whisper, and it was not a question. "Someone came," he said. "Yes," said the Cold Mercy. His hand, gray and slow, found the edge of the cradle. The fingers did not all work yet. He made them work. 800 years of stillness fought him, and he won the first small fight of the war he had been buried to fight, and he dragged himself up against the burning in his blood until he was sitting, hunched, breathing the metal air, a very old man at the bottom of an ocean of ice. "How long?" he said. 804 years, 2 months, 9 days, the ship said. He absorbed that, the way a man absorbs the news of a death he had long ago decided to expect. 800 years. Everyone he had ever known, everyone the young ones had loved, all of it gone to dust above him, while he lay in the dark, with 339 others, holding a single beat between them, like a coal in cupped hands. He had known it would be like this. Knowing did not make it light. He let it sit on him for exactly 3 breaths, because 3 breaths was what he could afford, and then he set it down where he set every grief, in the deep cold place a soldier keeps such things, and he reached for the work. "The crew," he said. 340 aboard, including you," said the Cold Mercy. "All cradles nominal, none lost. I have begun the wake sequence on standby. I waited for you." He almost smiled. The ship had been built to wake him first. The ship had been built to make the old man take the first breath and the first decision, because the planners of the Reliquary Watch had understood something about endurance that the young ones never quite did, which was that endurance is not a machine and not a number. It is a person who refuses. "Show me," Trent said. The ceiling above him cleared and became a window that was not a window, a feed from the hull sensors 4 kilometers down in the glacier. He saw the lamps first, hard and blue and alien. He saw the carbon thread, climbing away into the dark. He saw the probe, a thing of black segments and patient arms, pressed against the flank of his ship like a tick on the hide of a sleeping animal. He looked at it for a long time. He had seen a great many enemy machines in his 40 years. He had never seen one that frightened him by being calm. This one was calm. It had the stillness of a thing that was in no hurry at all, a thing that had all the time in the universe and knew it. The machines he had fought in the bright years had been hungry, fast, desperate, the tools of species racing each other to the grave. This one had no hunger in it. It had no race left to run. It had the bearing of something that had already won, 100 times, against 100 braver foes, and had come here only to collect. "What is it?" he said quietly. "Unknown," said the cold Mercy. "No match in any record I carry. But it is old, Captain. The alloys are degraded in patterns that suggest tens of thousands of years of service. And it is reading us. It believes we are dead." "Tens of thousands of years," Trent repeated. He turned the number over. He had served 40 years. Humanity had spoken to the stars for a few short centuries before the silence. This thing had been crawling through the dark, patient and certain, since before there was a word for human at all. "It's old enough to have buried everyone who ever met it," he said, "which means everyone who ever met it is gone, and it's never been told no." "That would follow," the ship agreed. Trent looked at the patient machine pressed to his hull, and something very old and very stubborn moved behind his gray eyes. He thought of the cold rooms, and the people who would not listen, and the 12 ships that had, and the single rule they had carved into the heart of every cradle before they closed their eyes. He thought of the long bet they had made against the dark, the bet that silence could be a weapon, if you only had the patience to load it. The dark had finally come to call. "Good," he said. "Let it." He gripped the rail beside the cradle and began, very slowly, to stand. His legs did not want him. He made them want him. Above him, 4 kilometers of ice. Below him, 340 hearts beginning, one by one, to remember their purpose. And on his hull, an ancient patient thing, certain it had come to a grave. "Wake the ship," Captain Aldous Trent said. "All of it. We have kept this one waiting long enough." The cold Mercy woke the way a city wakes, not all at once, but block by block, light by light, deck by deck. Captain Trent gave the order from the head of the cradle, his voice still cracked, and the ship took it and began. First the spine. The cold Mercy was 940 meters from her armored prow to the great cold throat of her main drive, and her spine ran the whole length of her, a single forged keel that had not flexed in 8 centuries because the planners had set her down on a flat shelf of bedrock and let the glacier come. Now warmth crept along that spine, joint by joint, and the metal ticked and sang as it remembered how to bear its own weight again. Then the cores. The slow decay reactor that had kept the captain's heart beating once every 25 years was a coal, a watchfire, nothing more. The real power lay deeper, 4 fusion bottles the size of houses, banked and sealed and waiting. The cold Mercy lit the first of them, 11 minutes after Trent opened his eyes. It did not light it loudly. It eased it up like a man easing a cold engine on a winter morning, and the deep hum of it climbed up through the ice, and the probe far below felt the faintest tremor in the hull, and recorded it and, again, set it aside. Slethmarrow 12 had felt dead ships settle 10,000 times. It did not yet understand that this was not settling. This was a thing standing up. Trent pulled himself out of the cradle on the 14th minute. His legs did not want him. He made them want him. There was a rail by the cradle, set there for exactly this, and he hauled himself along it, hand over hand, while the floor heated under his bare feet, and the lights came up amber and then white. His muscles were 800 years old and 4 minutes used. Every one of them burned. He had been a young man once who could run the length of the spine in full armor. He was not that man. He was something the planners had judged more useful, a man who had already decided not to stop. "Crew," he said, "wake them, in order." "Wake order, Captain?" "Engineering first, then weapons, then medical, to catch the ones who don't wake clean, then the rest." He paused, gripping the rail. breathing. Vance. Sergeant Cora Vance, Cradle 31, the ship said. She requested early wake before sleep. Her note is logged. Read it. It says, "Wake me when it gets interesting." Something moved in Trent's gray face that was almost warmth. "Wake her second," he said. "Right after engineering. She'll want to be here for this." Cradle 31 warmed. 2 decks down and 100 meters forward. A woman who had been 34 years old for 804 years took her first hard breath, and the first thing Cora Vance did upon returning to the living was swear, fluently and with feeling, at the cold. She was a soldier from a line of soldiers. Her grandmother had served in the ships that came before the Reliquary Watch, in the last bright years, when humanity still spoke and was still heard. And she had told young Cora that the worst day of the war was not the loud one, but the quiet one. The day they understood that no one was answering, and decided to go to ground rather than go out. Cora had carried that story into the ice, the way another soldier might carry a photograph. She had not believed in the quiet either. That was why she was here, in the ice, with the old man and the buried ship, and a note that said, "Wake me when it gets interesting." It was, apparently, interesting. The crew woke in the order Trent set, and the ship caught the rough ones. 41 of the 340 did not wake clean. Their blood fought them, or their hearts stumbled, or the long cold had laid a hand too heavy on them, and the medical bay took those 41 and warmed them slower, and brought every one of them back, because the planners of the Reliquary Watch had built the cradles the way they built everything, which was to outlast the men who doubted them. The ship logged not one failure in 804 years. 340 had gone into the ice, 340 came out. Cora found Trent at the head of the spine 90 minutes later, in a uniform that hung loose on a frame that 8 centuries had not improved, standing in front of the great curved display of the command deck, while the screens lit one after another around him like windows opening in a dark house. She had pulled herself together faster than he had, because she was younger, and because she was furious, and fury is a kind of fuel. "Captain," she said. Her voice worked better than his. "Tell me someone finally came, so I didn't sleep 800 years for a glacier shift." "Someone came," Trent said, and pointed at the central screen. She looked at the probe. She looked at it the way he had, taking its measure, and she came to the same conclusion he had, and she did not like it any better. "That's not a scout," she said. "Scouts are in a hurry. That thing's been hanging on our hull for how long?" 9 days, by the ice record, said the cold Mercy. 9 days, Cora repeated. "It drilled 9 days down to look at us, and it hasn't fired a shot or pulled a sample worth the name. It's just looking." "It's confirming," Trent said. "It thinks we're a grave. It came to make sure the grave is closed." He turned from the screen. The command deck was filling now, slow figures finding their stations, gray-faced, stiff, alive. They moved like people who had slept too long and woken into a thing that mattered, which was exactly what they were, and not one of them asked to go back under. The planners had chosen them for that too. "I want everything it is," Trent said. "Where it came from, what sent it, and what it's afraid of, because everything is afraid of something." Far below, in the cold and the dark, the thing it came from was thinking about humanity. The long patience did not think the way warm minds think. It did not think in a hurry, and it did not think alone. It was distributed across 100,000 quiet bodies, seeded through the dark like spores, probes and listeners, and slow gardeners of extinction, and Sleth Marrow 12 was one node of its enormous and ancient attention. Through that node, it now turned the long lens of its memory upon the species that called itself human, and it remembered. It remembered them from the bright years. They had been loud. They had thrown radio into the dark with both hands. They had built and burned and bred and argued, and the long patience had marked them the way it marked all the loud ones, with patience, because the loud ones did the work of dying for you if you only waited. You did not need to fight a flame. You needed to be the dark that came after it. The long patience had outlasted 406 species in this manner across its long career, and it counted them not with pride, for it had no pride, but with a cold and total certainty, the way a glacier counts the valleys it has filled. Its method had never once failed, and the reason it had never failed was a single law the universe had handed the entity at the start of its long existence and never once revoked. That warm things cannot wait. Warm things burn. Warm things are made of hurry, of hunger, of short, fierce lives that spend themselves and end. A warm species, given a slow enough enemy, will always do the enemy's work for it. It will exhaust itself. It will fracture. It will fight itself when it runs out of others to fight, and it will go quiet, and then the dark comes down. The long patience had simply been the slowest, most certain dark in the galaxy for 40,000 years, and so the long patience had simply, always, won. It had watched the humans burn bright. Then it had watched them go quiet. 8 centuries passed. All at once, the radio dimming, and the ships ceasing, and the worlds going dark, and it had felt the old satisfaction. Another flame out. Another valley filled. It had sent no fleet. It never sent fleets. It had simply made a note in its vast, slow ledger, and let the centuries do the burying. And now, 800 years later, it had sent one patient probe to confirm what it already knew, that the small, loud ape things were gone, and their bones were cold. The note had read, extinct, self-inflicted, no contest. Slethmarrow 12 had come to close the file. That was all. The long patience closed its files the way a careful keeper closes a book, with certainty, and the certainty of the long patience had never once in 40,000 years been misplaced. So when the buried hull beneath its probe grew warm, it did not believe its own sensors. The temperature reading climbed from -210 degrees, where it had sat like a stone for 8 centuries, and it climbed slowly, and then less slowly, and the long patience watched the number rise with something that, in a warm mind, might have been the first faint cousin of unease. It ran the obvious checks: sensor fault, geothermal vent, radioactive decay in the wreck. It found no fault, no vent. The decay it found was wrong, far too ordered. A power source being managed, rather than a corpse going to rot. It widened its attention. It called more of itself toward this small, cold world. Across the dark, other nodes turned, other listeners woke from their long drifting, and the long patience began, for the first time in 406 closed files, to reopen one. It did this without alarm, because it did not feel alarm, but it did it with the full weight of its method, because the method had never failed, and the method said, be certain. So it gathered itself to be certain. It reached back, as it gathered, into the deepest layers of its memory, because the method also said, when a pattern breaks, compare it against every pattern you have ever known. And the long patience had known a great many. It had known the burrowers of Thren, who had dug themselves so deep into their world to escape it, that they had simply never come up again. And it had waited above their sealed tunnels for 9,000 years, until the last seismic flutter of them stopped, and then it had filed them closed. It had known the ring builders of the Merrick Drift, who had wrapped their star in a cage of light and thought themselves untouchable, and it had not touched them, had only dimmed their star 1 part in 1,000 each century, so slowly that they argued among themselves about whether it was happening at all, until the cold took them, and the argument ended. It had known the long-lived ones of Selu, who had stretched their own lives across millennia to outlast it, and it had simply outlasted their patience. Because a stretched life is still a fast life wearing a slow coat, and the fast thing underneath always, always tired. In none of these memories did the long patience find a match for the thing now warming beneath the ice. None of the 406 had chosen the cold. None had built a tomb on purpose, and lain down in it whole and waiting. They had all, every one, been running from the dark when the dark caught them. This thing was not running. This thing had buried itself to meet the dark on its own ground, and that, the entity understood with the first slow turning of true unease, was a thing it had no pattern for at all. The hull spoke. It was not a signal aimed at the probe. It was simply that the cold mercy, coming alive, began to talk to herself the way a great machine must, internal traffic blooming across her length, and the probe, pressed to her flank, heard the edges of it leak through the metal. It heard checksums. It heard handshakes. It heard a ship the length of a small mountain running through 800 years of stored procedure, and finding, deck by deck, that everything still worked. Slethmarrow 12 relayed this to the whole of the long patience, and the whole of the long patience considered it, and across 100,000 bodies and a span of slow centuries trained thought, It arrived at a conclusion it had never before been forced to reach. The grave was not a grave. The silence had not been death. The flame the long patience believed it had outlasted had not gone out. It had been banked, on purpose, by hands that knew the dark was coming and decided to wait in it. This was, to the long patience, very close to inconceivable. It had built its entire being, its entire method, the whole vast architecture of its endurance, on a single law that the universe had never once broken for it, that warm things cannot wait. But here was a warm thing that had chosen the cold. Here was a warm thing that had lain in the ice for 800 years on purpose, with 340 hearts slowed nearly to stopping, waiting for exactly this, waiting for the patient ones to finally come digging. The category the long patience had filed humanity under was breaking in its grip, and the long patience, which did not feel fear because fear was a fast emotion and it had outlived all fast things, felt instead the slow grinding sensation of a certainty under strain. It did the only thing its long nature allowed. It decided to wait and watch and be sure. It withdrew the probe's drill and let the segmented body settle against the hull, and it lowered its lamps to a watching glow, and it told itself the old true thing, the thing that had never failed it. Whatever wakes will tire. Whatever burns will burn out. I have only to be here afterward. On the command deck of the Cold Mercy, 11 hours after he opened his eyes, Captain Aldous Trent stood at the rail of his living ship and watched the probe go still and dark and patient on the feed, and he understood, because he was old and had fought patient enemies before, exactly what it had decided. "It's going to wait us out," he said. Cora Vance, at the weapons station now, her gray face set hard, looked up. "It dug for 9 days. It's not in a hurry." "No," Trent said. "It's never in a hurry. That's its whole strength." He looked at the dark thing on his hull, and the corner of his mouth moved. "It thinks waiting is something it owns. It thinks it invented patience." He set both hands on the rail, an old man at the head of an old ship, 8 centuries deep in the ice, and his gray eyes were perfectly calm. "We built this ship to wait, Sergeant. We built her to sleep through whatever the dark sent, and wake up meaner than we went in. That thing wants a patience contest." He almost smiled. It came to the wrong grave. The Cold Mercy spent the next 19 hours becoming herself. The fusion bottles came up to full one by one, and the cold throat of the main drive filled with controlled fire for the first time in 8 centuries. Not to move yet, only to feed. Power flooded the spine. The weapon decks woke. Trent walked them himself, slow and stubborn, leaning on Vance's arm when the corridors ran long, and he laid his old hand on the breeches of guns that had slept as long as he had. He spoke to the gun crews, the few words an old captain has for soldiers who have given 800 years to a single fight, and the words were not many, and they were enough, because the soldiers had chosen the ice for the same reason he had. The Cold Mercy was a warship of a kind the galaxy no longer remembered, because the galaxy had decided that humanity was a brief loud thing now safely extinct, and so no one had updated their fear. She carried 4 spinal accelerators in her keel, mass drivers 900 meters long that used the whole length of the ship as a barrel, and each could throw a 30-ton slug to a fraction of light and put it through a moon. She carried 216-point defense lances along her flanks. She carried a magazine of relativistic torpedoes whose yields were measured not in tons, but in the simple, brutal arithmetic of mass and velocity, and she carried, deep in her armored heart, behind 9 bulkheads and the captain's own authorization, a thing the planners had named only the last word, and had hoped no captain would ever have cause to speak. She was, by the standards of her makers, a single ship of the line. There had been 12 of her, once, the Reliquary Watch, 12 graves seated across 12 frozen worlds where no patient enemy would think to dig. 11 still slept. The Cold Mercy did not know if they would ever wake. She knew only that she had woken, and that something was on her hull that believed she was dead. "Status," Trent said, on the command deck, on the 20th hour, with 340 of his crew at their stations, and his ship humming around him at full, and his enemy waiting patient and certain in the ice below. "All systems nominal," said the Cold Mercy. 804 years in the ice, Captain. Not one fault. We are whole." "Crew?" 340 alive. The 41 rough wakes are cleared by medical and standing their stations. None lost. Trent nodded slowly. None lost. The planners had been right about the cradles. The planners had been right about a great many things. And the thing they had been most right about was the simplest and the hardest, which was that you cannot beat patience with speed. You can only beat it with more patience. And that the deepest patience of all is not the patience to wait, but the patience to wake. Open a channel to that probe, he said. Plain language. Let it translate. The channel opened. The whole command deck went quiet. Below them in the ice, the probe of the long patience registered the carrier wave, and the great distributed mind behind it turned its full ancient attention to the small cold world and the impossible warm thing rising out of it, certain still, certain always, that whatever the grave said, the grave would in the end fall silent again. Captain Aldous Trent leaned toward the channel, an old soldier woken from 800 years of sleep to find his enemy had finally arrived, and he spoke. "This is the human warship Cold Mercy," he said, in a voice gone steady now, the cracks burned out of it. "We are not a grave. We are not extinct. We have been waiting for you." He paused, and the ice creaked, and the probe listened. "You came to confirm we are dead. Confirm this instead. We chose the cold. We slept on purpose. And we set one rule before we closed our eyes." His gray gaze did not move from the dark patient thing on his hull. "If anyone ever came digging, we would wake. You came digging." The channel hissed. The long patience did not answer, because answering was a fast thing's habit, and it had outlived all fast things. "It won't talk," Cora said quietly. "No," Trent agreed. "It'll wait." He straightened and put his old hands behind his back and looked at his enemy with 800 years of stored and stubborn patience of his own. "So will we, but we'll wait with the guns warm." The long patience answered. In the end, the only way it knew how. It tried to bury them again. It did not fire. Firing was loud, and the long patience had not survived 40,000 years by being loud. Instead, it called the cold. Across the dark, the 100,000 quiet bodies of the entity began to converge on the small frozen world. Not in a rush, never in a rush, but on the slow, inexorable schedule of a tide coming in. The first of them arrived 11 days after the Cold Mercy woke, and it was not a warship. It was a smotherer. The crew of the Cold Mercy watched it come on the long-range feed, a thing the size of a city, dull and gray, and shaped like nothing so much as a vast spreading hand. It did not approach the planet. It took up a slow orbit at a great distance, and then it began to unfold. "Talk to me," Trent said, at the rail. "It is deploying a screen," said the Cold Mercy. "A cloud, particulate, magnetic, and very fine. It is spreading across our entire sky." "To do what?" "To wait," the ship said, and there was something almost like understanding in the dry voice. "Captain, I believe it intends to seal this world, to put us back under. If it lays enough screen between us and the stars, it can darken this planet. Cool it. Refreeze the surface over centuries. It does not need to kill us. It only needs to put us back to sleep and outlast us." Cora Vance laughed, short and hard, from the weapons station. "It's trying to tuck us back in." "It's trying to do to us what it does to everyone," Trent said. "Cover the flame and walk away, and come back in 1,000 years to sweep the ashes." He watched the gray hand unfold across his sky, patient, certain, enormous. And he understood at last the full shape of the thing he faced. It had never once needed to win a fight. It had only ever needed to be the last one still moving when the fighting stopped. Every species it had outlasted had burned itself out, trying to live fast in front of a thing that lived slow. The long patience had never been beaten because no one had ever brought it the one weapon it could not answer, a patience deeper than its own. "It's a good plan," Trent said quietly. "It's the plan that's worked 406 times. He turned from the screen. "Sergeant, what does it cost the enemy to lay that screen?" Cora frowned, then caught his meaning, and bent to her station. "Time," she said. "Material. It's spinning that cloud out of itself, out of that big hand. It's not infinite. It's spending. It's spending centuries it thinks it has," Trent said, "because it thinks we'll sleep through the spending." He set his jaw. "It's right about one thing. We could. This ship could go back under for another 800 years and wake again on a world that thing has frozen, and we'd still wake meaner than whatever it left to watch us. It cannot outweight us. It does not yet know that. His gray eyes were cold. But I'm not going back in the ice. Not this time. This time we're going to teach it the difference between silent and dead. There was a long silence on the command deck. Then a younger officer at the navigation station, a man named Ostrand who had been 26 for 8 centuries, spoke up, because he had to. "Sir," he said, "if it's right that we could sleep through it, then waiting it out is the safe play. We go back under. We wake when it's gone. No one dies." Trent looked at him, and there was no anger in the look, only the weariness of an old man who had answered this argument in cold rooms 1,000 years before. "That's the trap, Ostrand," he said. "That's the trap it's set for the whole galaxy, and the whole galaxy walked into it. Everyone went quiet. Everyone went to ground. Everyone decided the safe play was to hide and wait and hope. And one at a time, over 40,000 years, it found them in their holes, and it pulled the dark down over them, and it won." He shook his head slowly. "If we sleep, we hand it the next 800 years to perfect the burial. The only way to beat a thing that bets on you hiding is to stop hiding. We wake. We stand up. We make it fight in the open, where its patience is worth nothing, and our guns are worth everything." He held the young man's eyes. "No one dies today by waiting. People die in 1,000 years, in the ice, never knowing the dark came down. I have seen that ending. I went to sleep to prevent it. We are awake now. We fight now." Ostrand held his gaze a moment, and then he nodded, and turned back to his station, and that was the end of the argument, the last one anyone ever raised aboard the Cold Mercy. The long patience laid its screen for 31 days. It worked with the unhurried thoroughness of a thing that had done this before. Sleth Marrow 12, still pressed to the hull 4 kilometers down, fed the great mind a steady stream of the warm ship's behavior, and the warm ship's behavior was, to the entity, deeply reassuring. The Cold Mercy did not flee. It did not attack the smotherer. It sat in its grave of ice and ran its systems and waited. And waiting was a thing the long patience understood as the prelude to defeat. Because everything it had ever buried had waited too, at the end, had gone quiet and patient and accepting as the dark came down. The entity recognized the posture of a thing settling in to die slowly, because it had witnessed that posture 406 times, and it was certain, with the whole weight of its long career, that it was witnessing it again. It was wrong, and the manner of its wrongness was the manner the planners of the Reliquary Watch had foreseen 800 years before, sitting in their cold rooms on a world now dust, designing a ship to defeat an enemy they had not yet met, but had correctly imagined, a slow one, a patient one, a thing that conquered by attrition and would not be hurried. "You cannot beat such a thing by being faster," the planners had written. "You can only beat it by being more willing. It expects you to spend yourself in a hurry, so do not hurry. Let it commit. Let it pour its slow strength into burying you. And when it has spent enough that it cannot easily withdraw, wake, and pay out everything at once." Trent had read those words 800 years ago, and again on the day he woke, and he followed them now, with the patience of a man who had already proven he could sleep through centuries to keep a promise. The 31 days were not idle days. Below the ice, the Cold Mercy ran her crew through 800 years of stored drill, and the drill held, because the planners had built the crew the way they built the cradles, to be older than their doubts. The gun crews ran dry cycles on the spinal accelerators until the breaches were warm and true. The torpedo deck pulled every weapon from the racks, inspected the long sleep on each one, and racked them again, and not one had failed. Cora Vance walked the point defense lances along both flanks of the ship, all 216 of them, and where the old long cold had stiffened a mount, she had it stripped and warmed and freed, until every lance on the ship could swing and track and fire as if 8 centuries were 8 minutes. Trent watched her work, on the feed and in person, and on the 22nd day, in the long quiet of the night watch, she came and stood beside him at the rail. "My grandmother told me the quiet day was the worst day," she said, not looking at him. "The day no one answered. She said the loud days you could fight, the quiet day you just had to live through." She watched the dark thing on the feed, the patient screen thickening across the sky. "I used to think she meant it broke them, I think now she meant the opposite. I think the quiet day is when they decided to do this. She gestured at the ship around them, the buried warship, the long bed against the dark. To go quiet on purpose, to make the silence a thing we did, instead of a thing that was done to us. That's exactly what she meant, Trent said. The quiet broke everyone who let it be done to them. We did it to ourselves first. He looked at the old enemy on the feed. That thing down there has buried 406 species that went quiet because they had no choice. It's about to meet the first one that went quiet because it did. Cora was silent a moment. Then she said, "Wake me when it gets interesting, sir." And there was a hard, small smile in it, and Trent almost laughed, and the night watch went on, and the dark thickened, and the trap closed one more day toward its spring. He let the entity lay its screen. He let it commit the smotherer and 3 more vast, slow bodies that drifted in over the 31 days to feed the cloud. He let the long patience pour weeks of its careful endurance into the work of darkening one small world. And he watched the entity grow comfortable, watched the rhythm of its certainty settle in, watched it stop expecting anything at all. It stopped reinforcing the probe's link. The Cold Mercy reported on the 29th day. The node on our hull is running on a reduced schedule. It is no longer treating us as an active contact. It has, I believe, reclassified us. As what? Trent asked. As a closing file. Cora Vance grinned without any warmth at all. It got bored of us. It got certain of us, Trent corrected. Same thing. For that one. He looked at the long-range feed, at the 4 enormous patient bodies hanging in the dark spinning their cloud, at the gray screen thickening across the sky, at the enemy that had committed itself, slowly and thoroughly, to the work of burying a flame it believed could not fight back. He had waited 800 years for a reason. He had waited 31 more days for a better one. The entity was as deep into its own strategy as it was ever going to get. "Weapons," he said. "Captain," said Cora, and her hand settled on her station. "How long to break orbit and clear the ice?" The Cold Mercy answered. "The glacier above us is 4,100 meters at the shaft, and forms a dome over the hull. To rise, I must shed it. I can do this in one of 2 ways. Slowly, melting upward, over 40 hours, undetected until late, or all at once." Define all at once. I fire the main drive against the bedrock and lift through 4 kilometers of ice in 11 seconds, the ship said. It will be visible from orbit. It will be visible from the next star system. It will announce us to everything within 4 light years. Trent considered this for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and out one time. The whole point of that thing, he said, nodding at the screen and the patient bodies behind it, is that no one announces themselves anymore. Everyone hides. Everyone goes quiet. Everyone waits in the dark hoping it forgets them. That's how it wins. It wins because we all agreed to be silent. He set his old hands on the rail of his living ship. I'm done being silent. Lift all at once. Let everything within 4 light years see exactly what came out of the ice. The Cold Mercy did not hesitate, because she had been built by people who did not hesitate either. 4 kilometers down, Sleth Marrow 12 felt the hull beneath it change. The change was not subtle. The change was the opposite of subtle, and that was its own kind of shock to a mind built on the reading of subtle signs. The slow decay watchfire, the trickle the entity had monitored for weeks as the dim pulse of a dying thing, vanished, swamped, as the full output of 4 fusion bottles and a main drive, built to push a 900-meter warship to a fraction of light, woke all at once beneath 4,000 meters of ice. The probe's sensors saturated. For the first time in 40,000 years, a node of the long patience was simply blinded, overwhelmed, by the sheer warm violence of a thing it had filed as a corpse. Then the ice broke. It did not crack. It did not split. 4,100 meters of ancient glacier, the weight of mountains, the patient burial the entity had spent 8 centuries trusting, came apart in 11 seconds as the Cold Mercy stood up on a column of fusion fire and drove herself through it like a fist through a frozen pond. The shaft the entity had drilled for 9 days was erased in an instant. The probe, Sleth Marrow 12, the patient-watching node that had pressed itself to the hull and waited and been so very certain, was annihilated in the first half-second, vaporized in the throat of the drive plume, its last transmission, a single fragmentary burst that reached the great mind in orbit and conveyed, before it ended, exactly nothing that the great mind could use. The long patience lost a node. It had lost nodes before, to stars, to time, to the slow accidents of the dark. It did not feel the loss as pain, but it felt, for the first time in 40,000 years, the loss as surprise, and surprise was a fast thing's experience, and the entity recoiled from it, the way a glacier might recoil from a flame held suddenly to its face. On the command deck of the Cold Mercy, the crew felt the ship rise. They felt 4,000 meters of ice tear away above them. They felt the long-buried weight of the planet fall behind. They felt their warship, 940 meters of forged keel and fusion fire and sleeping guns now waking, climb out of her grave on a pillar of light that lit the frozen world from pole to pole, that boiled the glacier to vapor in a cloud the entity's screen could not darken, that announced to everything within 4 light-years, in a language older than caution, that something had come out of the ice. Trent stood at the rail with his hands behind his back and watched the dead white world fall away on the feed and the black stars open above, and his gray face was the face of a man keeping a very old promise. "Where's the enemy?" he said. 4 large bodies in distant orbit, spinning the screen, the Cold Mercy reported. The ship's voice had changed. There was fire in it now, the fire of full power, the fire of 800 years of stored intent finally turned outward. "They are not maneuvering. Captain, they have not yet reacted. The entity's response time is measured in days. It does not move fast, because it has never once in its existence needed to move fast." Cora Vance looked up from the weapons station, with something fierce and bright in her gray eyes. "It can't keep up," she said. "It can't even keep up with us breaking orbit. We're faster than it can think." "No," Trent said quietly, and his voice carried down the whole command deck. "We're not faster than it. Nobody's ever been faster than it. That's the trap. Everyone tries to be faster and burns out, and it waits, and it wins." He watched the 4 great patient bodies hang motionless in the dark, beginning only now, slowly, ponderously, to register that the grave had emptied. "We're not faster. We're more patient. We waited 800 years and 31 days to make it commit, and now it's committed, and it can't pull back fast enough either." His old jaw set. It bet everything on outlasting us. It never once planned for what to do if we outlasted it instead. He turned from the feed to face his crew, 340 woken souls at their stations, in a ship that had refused to die, and for the first time since the ice, Captain Aldous Trent smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "It thinks the fight is just starting," he said. "It thinks now is when the warm thing burns hot and brief and spends itself. It's wrong. We spent the last 800 years getting ready to throw one punch." He looked at Cora Vance, and at the sleeping guns, and at the cold, patient enemy that had finally, fatally, committed. "Charge the spinal accelerators," Captain Trent said. "All 4. Let's wake the rest of the ship." The 4 spinal accelerators of the Cold Mercy ran the entire length of her keel, and when they charged, the whole ship became a weapon, 940 meters long. It took 90 seconds to bring them to full. Trent spent the 90 seconds watching the enemy, because the enemy was, at last, beginning to move, and the way it moved told him everything. The 4 great bodies in distant orbit did not scatter. They did not raise screens or fire or flee. They turned, slowly, with the ponderous grace of things that had never in 40,000 years needed to turn quickly, and they began to draw together. The long patience, confronted with a warm thing that had risen from its grave, fell back on the only doctrine it had ever needed. It massed, it thickened. It made of its 4 enormous bodies a single greater shadow, and it began, with terrible deliberation, to do the thing that had buried 406 species before this one. It began to spread itself across the warship's path and smother her. "It's not running," Cora said. "It can't run," Trent said. "It's never had to learn how. Running is a fast thing's skill." He watched the 4 bodies merge into a vast spreading dark across the stars ahead, a wall of patient matter unfolding to swallow his ship whole. "It's going to do to us in the open what it does to everyone. Wrap us up, cool us down, wait." His gray eyes were steady. "It still thinks this is a contest of who lasts longer. It still does not understand that we already won that contest in the ice. The cold Mercy drove straight at the spreading dark. She did not slow. She did not turn. She accelerated, fusion fire roaring from her cold throat. 900 meters of forged keel aimed at the heart of the thing that had come to bury her, and the crew at their stations felt the whole ship lean into it, felt 800 years of stored patience become, in an instant, 800 years of stored momentum. Accelerators charged, the ship reported. All 4. Targets? The center of mass, Trent said. The thickest part, where it thinks it's safest. He watched the dark wall fill the forward feed. It's never been hit, Sergeant. 40,000 years and 406 kills, and it has never once been hit, because nobody it ever buried had anything left to hit it with. Let's correct the record. Fire. The cold Mercy fired her keel. 4 spinal accelerators, each 900 meters long, threw 4 30-ton slugs at a fraction of the speed of light in a single coordinated salvo, and the recoil ran through the whole length of the ship and the whole length of the crew, and Trent gripped the rail and rode it. The slugs crossed the distance to the enemy faster than the enemy could comprehend that they had been fired. They struck the merged dark of the Long Patience at the center of its mass, 4 impacts within a tenth of a second, and the energy of them was not measured in tons, but in the brutal arithmetic the planners had trusted 800 years before. Mass times velocity squared. The simplest and oldest violence in the universe. The violence of a thrown stone made absolute. The center of the Long Patience ceased to exist. The flash lit the system. It outshone the frozen world below, outshone the dim star this far world circled, and it tore a hole in the spreading dark that the entity had been so certain would close over the warm thing, and quietly extinguish it. One of the 4 great bodies was simply gone, converted to light and scattered matter in the space of a tenth of a second. A second body, caught at the edge of the impact, came apart in slow tumbling pieces, its patient architecture, built to last 10,000 years, never designed to survive a single instant of warm violence. The Long Patience, for the first time in 40,000 years, was hurt. It did not scream, because screaming was a fast thing's reflex. But across its 100,000 quiet bodies, across the slow, vast web of its distributed mind, something passed that it had no name for, because it had never needed one, because in 40,000 years, it had never lost 2 bodies in a tenth of a second to a thing it had filed as dead. The certainty that was the bedrock of its being, the absolute knowledge that warm things burn out and patient things win, cracked, and through the crack came something cold and unfamiliar and entirely new. The entity did the thing it had never once in its existence had to do. It tried to retreat. But retreat was a fast thing's skill, and the Long Patience had never learned it. And the 2 surviving great bodies, vast and slow and built for endurance and not for flight, began to draw back from the warship at a speed so ponderous that it was, to the cold Mercy, no speed at all. "It's pulling back," Cora said, disbelief and savage joy in equal measure in her voice. "Captain, it's actually trying to run, and it can't. It's too slow. It built itself too slow." "It built itself to last," Trent said. Lasting and running are different shapes. He watched the 2 great bodies labor away from him through the dark, enormous and helpless, and he felt no mercy, because the thing fleeing him had buried 406 species and meant to make humanity the 407th, and had been, until 90 seconds ago, entirely certain it would. "Recharge the accelerators, bring the torpedoes up, and open the channel." The channel opened. Trent leaned toward it, an old man in a ship that had risen from 800 years of ice, and he spoke to the patient ancient thing that was, at last, afraid. "You came to confirm we were dead," he said. "Confirm this instead. You have outlasted 406 species. You will not outlast the 407th. He watched the dark labor away from him. "You bet your whole existence on the law that warm things cannot wait. We broke your law. We waited longer than you, and we woke harder than you. And now you are learning the thing you never planned for, which is that silent never meant dead." His gray eyes were cold as the ice he had risen from. "You spent 40,000 years being the thing that comes after. There is no after. This time, we are the thing that comes after you." The Long Patience did not answer, but it changed. Across the dark, the 100,000 quiet bodies of the entity, The probes and the listeners, and the slow gardeners of extinction, seeded through 1,000 systems, all turned at once, toward the small, far world, where a warm thing had risen and hurt the unhurt thing. The entity called itself together. It abandoned, in an instant of cold calculation that cost it more than it had ever spent, 400 years of patient work across a dozen systems, and it poured every body it could move toward the cold mercy, because for the first time in 40,000 years, the long patience had encountered something it could not outlast, and its only remaining strategy was the one it had always despised: mass, and overwhelm, and crush by sheer numbers, a thing that could not be buried. The cold mercy did not wait for the swarm to gather. She finished what she had started. She ran down the 2 laboring survivors of the first 4 bodies one at a time, and she did it not with the great keel guns, but with the torpedoes, because the planners had taught that you spend the cheap weapons on the slow targets, and save the keel for the moment that decides everything. The relativistic torpedoes crossed the dark in seconds, and the 2 great patient bodies, which had ruled by never being in a hurry, died because they could not get out of the way of things that were. The first came apart in a slow gray bloom. The second, struck twice, simply stopped, drifting dead and dark, a city-sized corpse the entity could no longer feel. 2 confirmed, the cold mercy reported. The first 4 bodies are accounted for, Captain. The screen is collapsing without them to spin it. Sunlight is reaching the frozen world for the first time in 31 days. Trent did not look back at the world he had risen from. He looked forward, into the dark, where the rest of the entity was gathering. More incoming, the cold mercy said, and the feed was filling now, point after point after point. A great many more. Captain, the entity is converging from across at least 9 systems, hundreds of bodies. They will arrive over the coming days, in waves. Days, Trent repeated, and almost laughed. It still thinks in days, even now. He watched the swarm gathering in the dark, the slow tide of a thing that had ruled the galaxy by attrition, turning its full weight at last upon one ship. It's going to throw everything it is at us, everything it spent 40,000 years building. It's going to bet that we can't kill all of it before it buries us. He set his jaw. It's a good bet, against a normal ship. We are not a normal ship. He turned from the feed and faced his crew, 340 souls in a warship built to wait, now called to fight the largest thing in the dark, and he gave them the truth, because they had earned it in 800 years of ice. This thing has more bodies than we have shells, he said plainly. If this becomes a numbers fight, we lose it slowly, and slow losing is the only kind it knows how to inflict. So we will not give it a numbers fight. He looked at Cora Vance. Sergeant, behind 9 bulkheads, in the heart of this ship, there is a weapon the people who built her named the last word. They built it for one purpose, to be used against an enemy that could not be outfought, only outwilled. They built it hoping no captain would ever need it. His gray eyes were perfectly calm. I have needed it for 800 years. Wake it. Cora Vance held his gaze for one long moment, and then she nodded, and her hands moved across her station, and deep in the armored heart of the cold mercy, behind 9 bulkheads and the captain's own authorization, the last word began to wake. But the last word would not be ready for hours, and the first wave of the swarm would not wait hours, and so the cold mercy fought. The first 30 bodies of the gathering entity arrived ahead of the rest, the nearest ones, the ones that had been seated closest to this far cold world, and they came on in the only way the long patience knew, slow and certain and sure that mass would tell. They did not come to destroy the warship. They came to wrap her, to slow her, to begin the long smothering, and they spread themselves across her path the way they had spread across her sky, gray and patient and enormous. The cold mercy met them with the point defense lances Cora Vance had freed in the long quiet, all 216 of them, and she met them with the recharged accelerators, and she met them with 800 years of stored fury finally let off its leash. The lances reached out and cut. They were built to kill incoming fire, to swat torpedoes and shells out of the dark, and they found the patient slow bodies of the entity exactly as easy to kill as torpedoes that had forgotten how to dodge. One after another, the gray bodies came apart, and the cold mercy did not slow, did not turn, drove straight through the gathering swarm, shedding wreckage from her flanks like a ship breaking ice. 11 down, the Cold Mercy reported. 19:26. Captain, the first wave is broken. They cannot close. They are too slow, and we are killing them faster than they can spread. It doesn't understand it's dying, Trent said, watching the gray bodies fall on the feed. It's never died. It thinks this is the cost of a victory it's already won. He set his jaw. Keep killing the wave. Save the keel guns. Save everything that matters, for when it's all here and all linked. He looked at the long-range feed, at the hundreds of bodies still converging from 9 systems, the true mass of the entity still hours and days away. This is just the part where it learns what we are. The lesson comes later. The first wave died in 40 minutes. 30 patient bodies that had crossed the dark certain of an easy burial, scattered now as wreckage across the warship's wake, and the long patients felt every one of them go, and could not understand, even now, even hurt, that it was losing, because losing was a thing that had only ever happened to other species, the fast ones, the loud ones, the ones who could not wait. The long patients felt the last word stir, even before it was finished. It did not know what it was. But across its converging swarm, across the slow, vast web of its mind, it felt the warm thing at the center of the small far world begin to gather a power unlike the violence it had already suffered, a deeper power, a final power, and the entity that had never feared anything because it had never needed to felt, fully and completely now, the thing it had spent 40,000 years making other species feel. It felt that it was running out of time. The realization broke over the long patience, the way light breaks over a thing that has lived only in the dark. Time had always been its ally. Time had been the weapon it never had to fire, the tide that always came in, the slow, certain engine that buried every flame. It had never once stood on the other side of time. It had never once been the thing for whom the clock ran short. And now, watching the warm ship gather its final strength, the long patience understood, too late. With the whole 40,000-year weight of its certainty collapsing all at once, the category error at the root of its long career. It had assumed that to be silent was to be finished. It had built everything on that assumption. 406 times the assumption had held. But humanity had not gone silent because it was finished. Humanity had gone silent because it was waiting, on purpose, in the cold, having looked at the patient dark and decided to outwait the thing that waited. The one enemy a patience-based foe could never defeat was a foe more patient than itself, a foe that would lie in the ice for 800 years on purpose and wake meaner. And the long patience had spent 40,000 years being absolutely certain that no such foe could exist, because no warm thing could be that cold. It had been wrong. It had been wrong for 800 years, while the proof of its wrongness lay frozen and waiting 4 kilometers under the ice, and now the proof had risen, and there was no after for the thing that came after, and the clock the long patience had never once watched was, at last, running out. In the heart of the Cold Mercy, the last word came to full. "It's awake, Captain," Cora Vance said quietly. Trent looked at the gathering swarm in the dark, the slow tide of the largest thing in the galaxy turning its full and final weight upon one risen ship, and he put his old hands behind his back, and he spoke the order the planners of the Reliquary Watch had built a weapon and a ship and a man to one day speak. "Then let's give the patient ones," Captain Aldous Trent said, "something to wait for." The last word was not a bigger gun. The planners of the Reliquary Watch had understood that against a thing with 100,000 bodies, a bigger gun only meant you died with one more empty magazine. The last word was a different kind of weapon entirely, and it was aimed not at the bodies of the long patients, but at the one thing the entity had never thought to defend, because it had never imagined it could be attacked. It was aimed at the connections between them. "Explain it to me again," Trent said, watching the swarm gather, the slow tide thickening in the dark across 9 systems, hundreds of patient bodies converging on his ship over the coming days. "The entity is one mind in many bodies," the Cold Mercy said. "It is distributed. Each body is slow, but the mind that coordinates them is the source of its patience and its certainty. The bodies are not the enemy. The web is the enemy. The planners reasoned that an entity that conquers by attrition must be coordinated, and that anything coordinated can be cut." The ship's dry voice carried, for the first time, something close to grim satisfaction. The last word is a coordinated pulse across every band the entity uses to speak to itself, tuned over 800 years of stored analysis of patient ancient signals. It does not kill the bodies. It severs the mind. It turns one patient thing into 100,000 blind and silent fragments that no longer know they are one. And then, the cold mercy said, they are exactly what the entity always believed everyone else was: silent, scattered, alone in the dark. The ship paused, and we hunt them one at a time, for as long as it takes. We have time, Captain. We were built to have time. Trent nodded slowly. 800 years ago, in a cold room on a world now dust, the planners had imagined this enemy, and this moment, and this weapon, and they had been right about all three, because they had been the kind of people who assumed the worst, and prepared for it, and then went to sleep in the ice to keep the promise. He had been one of them. He was the last of them awake. Range, he said. The last word has no range limit, the cold mercy said. It propagates along the entity's own connections. We need only the swarm to be linked, and it is linking now, drawing itself together to crush us. The ship's voice was steady. It is doing the one thing that makes the last word work. It is making itself one. Cora Vance looked up from the weapons station, her gray eyes fierce. It's gathering into a fist to hit us, she said, and the tighter it makes the fist, the more of it we cut at once. It can't help itself, Trent said. It only has one move: mass and overwhelm. It spent 40,000 years never needing a second one. He watched the dark thicken, the slow, vast tide of the long patience drawing together over the coming hours into one converging whole. Certain even now, even afraid, that numbers would bury what speed could not. Hold, he said. Let it gather. Let it commit everything, the way we did in the ice. They held for 11 hours. It was the hardest order Trent had given since the one that closed his eyes 800 years before, because holding meant watching the enemy grow, watching hundreds of patient bodies converge across the dark, watching the swarm thicken until it filled a quarter of the sky, and the long-range feed was a wall of slow gray hunger. The crew held it. 340 souls who had slept 8 centuries in the ice did not flinch at 11 hours, because the planners had chosen them for exactly that, had chosen people who understood that the deepest courage is not the courage to act, but the courage to wait for the right moment to act, and not one moment sooner. The bodies came on. They came from 9 systems, the accumulated patient strength of 40,000 years of victory, and as they came they linked, body to body, mind to mind, weaving themselves back into the single vast web that had ruled the dark since before humanity had a name. The entity did not know that in weaving itself whole again, it was threading the noose. It only knew the one true thing it had ever known, that numbers bury flame, and so it gathered its numbers, and it grew certain again, even in its fear, because certainty was the only shape its mind had ever held. At the 11th hour, the long patience completed its gathering. The whole of it that could be moved had been moved. Hundreds of bodies drew together into one converging mass, and turned, as one linked mind, certain and afraid, and committed past the point of any retreat, toward the single warm ship at the center of the small far world. It's all here, the cold mercy said. Captain, the entity is fully linked, fully committed. It has nothing left in reserve. It bet everything on this. The ship paused. If we fire now, we cut all of it at once. Trent looked at the wall of patient dark filling his sky, the largest thing in the galaxy gathered into one fist to crush one risen ship, and he thought of the 4 kilometers of ice, and the 800 years, and the 340 hearts, slowed nearly to stopping, and the single rule they had set before they closed their eyes. If anyone ever came digging, wake. Someone had come digging. They had woken. And now the patient ones, who had bet that time was on their side, were about to learn whose side time had truly been on all along. This is the human warship Cold Mercy, Trent said, into the open channel, into the gathered dark, to the ancient thing that had come to confirm a grave and found a soldier. You waited 40,000 years to be certain of one thing. Be certain of this instead. He straightened, an old man at the head of a living ship, and his gray eyes were as cold and as patient as the ice that had made him. We were never silent because we were dead. We were silent because we were waiting for you. "Speak the last word," said Captain Aldous Trent. Cora Vance spoke it. The last word crossed the dark along the entity's own connections, faster than the entity could comprehend, into the heart of the gathered swarm, and it did exactly what the planners had built it to do 800 years before. It did not flash, it did not burn. There was no fire and no thunder. There was only, across a quarter of the sky, a sudden and total silence, as one patient mind in hundreds of bodies was cut, all at once, into hundreds of blind and scattered fragments that no longer knew they had ever been one. The long patience ended in the manner it had ended 406 other things. It went quiet, but it did not go quiet the way it had made others go quiet, slowly, over centuries, with the dark coming gently down. It went quiet in an instant, mid-thought, mid-certainty, the vast slow web of its 40,000-year mind severed in a single stroke, and the last coherent thing that passed through it before it scattered was not a strategy, and not a defense, and not even fear. It was the realization, complete and too late, that it had been wrong about the one law it had built its entire existence upon. Warm things could wait. One warm thing had waited longer than the patient dark itself, had chosen the ice on purpose, had slept 800 years to keep a promise, and woken meaner than it went under, and there was, for the thing that had always been the thing that came after, no after at all. Then it was gone, scattered into hundreds of slow, blind fragments drifting in the dark, no longer a mind, no longer a patience, no longer anything but wreckage that would take 1,000 years to even know it had been beaten. The command deck of the Cold Mercy was silent for a long moment. Then Cora Vance let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 800 years, and she looked up at the captain, and there were tears standing in her fierce gray eyes that she did not bother to hide. "It's done," she said. "Captain, it's done." "No," Trent said quietly, watching the scattered fragments drift in the dark, the broken remains of the largest thing the galaxy had ever feared. "It's begun." He turned from the feed. "Those fragments are still out there, hundreds of them, blind and slow and harmless now, but the entity seeded itself across 1,000 systems over 40,000 years. There are listeners and gardeners and probes in the dark that the last word never reached, that never linked, that are still patient, and still certain, and still waiting." His gray eyes were steady. "Someone has to watch for them. Someone has to be awake when the next patient thing comes digging." The hunt took 11 years. The Cold Mercy crossed the dark from system to system, and one at a time she found the scattered fragments of the long patience, the blind drifting bodies and the silent severed listeners, and one at a time she ended them, with the spinal accelerators and the torpedoes and, where mercy was a thing that could be afforded, with nothing at all, leaving the harmless wreckage to drift dead in the dark. She found the slow gardeners that had been spreading cold across a dozen worlds, and she stopped them, and on 3 of those worlds, under ice the entity had laid, she found things that had gone quiet and waited, and not quite died, and she woke them, and told them the dark thing was gone. On the second of the 3 worlds the entity had buried, the Cold Mercy found no survivors at all, only the cold tombs of a people who had not been built to wait, and had not chosen to, and the crew stood their watch in silence, as the ship cleared the orbit and moved on. Trent ordered the dead world's name recorded, and its story kept, because someone had to remember the ones who had not been given the choice his own people had made. On the 3rd world, the survivors were machines, the last patient remnants of a thinking civilization that had powered itself down to a single slow thought to outlast the dark. And they did not understand at first that they had been rescued rather than collected, because in their long memory, rescue was not a thing that happened. It took the Cold Mercy 9 days to convince them. When they finally woke their cities and turned their lights back toward the returning sun, they sent the warship a single message in a language 800 years dead, and the message said only, "We did not believe anyone would come." Trent had it translated twice to be sure, and then he had it logged, and then he stood a long time at the rail saying nothing, an old man who had stayed awake so that, this once, someone would. The waking of those 3 worlds changed something in the crew, and in the old captain most of all. On the first, they found a people no larger than children, a few thousand of them huddled in caverns beneath ice their own sun could no longer melt, who had passed down across 100 generations, a story of a dark hand that had come and pulled the warmth from their sky and left them to dwindle. They had stopped believing the story was anything but a story. When the cold mercy burned the gardener out of their orbit and the sunlight came back, they did not cheer, because they had forgotten how. They only stood at the mouths of their caves and looked up, and that, Trent thought, watching them on the feed, was reason enough to have stayed awake. There was a moment, in the 7th year of the hunt, that Trent carried with him afterward, longer than any of the kills. The cold mercy had cornered one of the larger fragments, a severed listener, nearly the size of one of the first 4 bodies, drifting blind and slow in the dark between 2 dead stars. It did not flee, because it could not, and it did not fight, because it had nothing left to fight with. And as the cold mercy closed, the fragment did a thing none of the others had done. It spoke. It was not the voice of the long patience, because the long patience was gone, scattered, no longer one. It was the last echo of the entity's certainty running down in a single severed piece, and it spoke across the old band in the catalogued human script the entity had filed under extinct 40,000 years before. And what it said was a question, the first question the long patience had asked in its entire existence, because it had never before encountered anything it did not already know. How, the fragment said, how does a warm thing wait? Trent looked at it on the feed for a long moment, the broken patient thing that had buried 406 species, and asked, at the very end, the one thing it had never understood. It doesn't, he said, on the open channel. It chooses. And then he was quiet, because there was nothing more to say to a thing that had spent 40,000 years certain that choosing and waiting were different. And he gave the order, and the fragment went the way of all the rest, and the question went unanswered into the dark, which was, Trent thought, exactly the answer it deserved. She did not find any of the other 11 ships of the Reliquary Watch. They slept on, in their own graves of ice on their own frozen worlds, waiting for their own enemies to come digging, and Trent let them sleep, because that was the whole point of them, because a watch that all wakes at once is not a watch at all. He sent each of them, across the years, a single buried signal on the old band, a message that would wake no one but would lie in their cores like a coal kept warm. The first of us woke, the first of us won. The dark can be beaten, hold the line. The galaxy, slowly, began to remember Earth. The signal went out from the cold mercy across 11 years, in plain language on every band, the way no one had dared to speak in centuries. The patient ones are broken. The dark thing is gone. You can come out now. And one at a time, from worlds where they had gone to ground, from deep places, and quiet places, and graves of their own, the scattered survivors of 100 buried species began, very cautiously, to answer. Not many. The long patience had done its work too well over 40,000 years, for there to be many. But some. Enough. Captain Aldous Trent watched the dark begin to fill again with voices, and he did not go back into the ice. You could, Cora Vance told him, near the end of the 11 years, on the command deck of the Cold Mercy, both of them older now, the captain very old indeed. The cradle's still good. The ship would wait. You've earned the sleep. I have, Trent agreed. He looked at the feed, at the slowly filling dark, at the scattered fragments of the patient thing, drifting dead and harmless among the stars it had ruled for 40,000 years. But someone has to stay awake. The entity bet its whole existence that everyone sleeps eventually, that everyone goes quiet, that you only have to wait long enough, and the dark comes down. His gray eyes were calm. It was almost right. We almost proved it right. We went under for 800 years, and we nearly slept through everything. He shook his old head slowly. Not again. Not me. The dark sent one patient thing, and we beat it, because we'd set someone to wake. The next time it sends something, I want someone already awake to see it coming. He almost smiled. I've had enough sleep, Sergeant. 800 years is enough sleep for any man. So Captain Aldous Trent stayed awake. He did not stay awake out of fear, and he did not stay awake out of grief, though he carried both, the way all old soldiers carry both. He stayed awake because he had understood, in the 800 years of dark and the 11 years of hunting that followed, a truth the planners had only half written down. They had built a ship to wait. They had built a crew to sleep. But the last thing they could not build was the thing that decided when the waiting ended. And that thing was not a clock, and not a threshold, and not a line of code in a frozen core. It was a person who, having proven he could outlast anything, chose at last to stop outlasting and simply stand. The dark had 1,000 ways to wait. It had not one single way to stand, and that, in the end, was the whole of the difference between them. The Cold Mercy took up a long, slow orbit at the edge of human space, 940 meters of forged keel and waking fire, no longer buried, no longer silent, and she became what the planners had always hoped one of their 12 ships would one day become, and prayed none would ever need to be, a thing that watched. The crew of 340 took turns in the cradles and turns at the rail, sleeping and waking in shifts that spanned years, so that the ship would never again be fully under, so that there would always be a human heart beating warm at the watch. Cora Vance took the longest shifts of all, after the captain, because she had been the one to speak the last word, and she had decided that a thing she had helped end was a thing she would help guard. And at the head of the spine, at the rail of his living ship, the old captain kept the watch himself, year on year, refusing the long sleep he had earned, because he had learned the one thing the patient dark could never learn, which was that the deepest endurance is not the patience to wait, but the will to stay awake. Far out in the dark, the scattered fragments of the long patience drifted dead and broken among the stars, and somewhere among them, in some severed listener that would take 1,000 years to know it, the last cold echo of a 40,000-year certainty went on slowly failing, and would go on failing forever, because the thing it had been certain of was no longer true. Silent had never meant dead, it had only ever meant waiting, and the patient dark had finally met something that waited longer, woke harder, and chose, this time, never to sleep again. For 800 years, a human warship lay in the ice, and the patient ones, who came to confirm a grave, learned too late that the grave had only been keeping watch,